But there's other lessons that whether or not you're taking the drug, you get being in a classroom with maybe every other friend of yours is taking the drug. You learn about what happens when you step out of line, or you look bored, or you fidget, or you don't smile at the teacher just right, day in and day out. You learn that you're labeled and drugged. This has a powerful effect, not just on the children who are being subjected to the idea that they have broken brains, which is a lie, but also to the kids who are watching it. And you know, you remember the World War II movies and how everybody's always smoking in them? That was not an accident. That was real because the drug companies knew enough, the tobacco companies knew enough that if they could addict the young soldiers, they had them for life. So what's happening now that we're putting all these children on drugs? Why are the drug companies marketing so feverishly to children now? Because it's not just the children's market. It's a lifetime patient. Ritalin is presented as something that corrects biochemical imbalances. It causes them drastic, vicious imbalances in the brain. As an aside, just to give you a little bit of my own credentials, the NIMH is holding in November a whitewash of Ritalin, which it calls the Consensus Development Conference on ADHD and its Treatments. It's just a whitewash. They've just invited everybody they could think of who would support Ritalin, and then they have a panel who listens, objective panel, and then makes a conclusion, which will be spread throughout the press. More and more kids will be on it. Well, the NIH, National Institutes of Health, oversees NIMH, and they looked at this conference and they said, this is so lopsided, so they have forced NIMH to have me as a medical scientific expert on adverse reactions of stimulants. I know my stuff. And if you listen to me in the next 10 minutes, you will know more than the doctor who's prescribing the drug. I guarantee it. Just the next 10 minutes. You will know more. You read the book, and you'll know more than the director of the National Institute of Mental Health. Because when he was pushed by NIH to invite me to the conference and said, you know, you're going to be the scientific expert on adverse reactions, he said, I also want to discuss the mechanism of action from animal studies. He said, we have animal studies on that? We have hundreds. They don't know. They don't care. Oh, it's an upsetting thing. And I think, as an aside, I was talking to a reporter who didn't know me in Boston, was filming me. And he said, boy, did somebody do something to you as a kid? You seem so upset about what's happening to kids. I said, I was a kid once, were you? I went, oh my God. Ritalin and the amphetamines. We know basically first how the drugs affect behavior, why they work, and we basically know some of the worst of their adverse effects that we've at least been able to find. Could be many more we can't find. All of the stimulant drugs stimulate, in fact, 3 neurotransmitter systems in the brain that we know of. Now, there are hundreds of neurotransmitter systems. Many we haven't identified. The brain is totally beyond our comprehension at the present time. But we do know that it stimulates 3 of them: serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine. This is a very abnormal state. What the drug is doing is forcing the nerves to put out more of this than they ordinarily would, just like somebody jammed something into the carburetor of your car, only did it internally, right in the middle somehow, right in the brain itself. And then in addition to forcing the nerves to put out more of this substance than they ever would want to, it then blocks the removal of the substance. It's a double whammy. So you're flooding the engine, and then you're not letting the engine dry out. Now, how does the brain react to that? Let me go back to a little elementary biology. Imagine that I'm a nerve cell, and I have a dendron that reaches out to the next nerve cell. Now, in fact, there are a couple 100 billion of these nerve cells, and each one may make 10,000 connections. We're talking about something with trillions of connections beyond human conception, beyond computer conception. But let's isolate it a little bit. So I'm the nerve cell, and I'm reaching out to the next nerve cell. Anne-Marie, reach your hand back to me. All right, now, this wonderful woman is the other nerve cell that I'm trying to stimulate. And her hand is her dendrite that reaches back to me. And her fingers, we can imagine, are the receptors for the packets that I'm sending out of maybe dopamine or serotonin or norepinephrine. Now, when her fingers begin to feel how much is coming in her direction, they don't like it. The nerves don't like it. They know it's toxic. So the nerves begin to cut back on their own fingers. They destroy their own fingers, their own receptors. And in the case of amphetamine, which is given to kids, and methamphetamine, we know they kill the brain cells. We know it. I knew it when I wrote the book, but when I started getting into the more recent, last year's research, more and more studies, it's now accepted by the laboratory scientists that methamphetamine and amphetamine kill brain cells. What about methylphenidate? Well, they're not doing studies on it because the drug company's so powerful. But it's not just a cousin, it's practically the same thing. It's practically the same thing. And we know enough from a few studies that the effects are the same, because it's in fact a universal pharmacological truth that the vast majority of drugs that stimulate a portion of the brain will cause that portion to die back in self-defense. And we're doing this to growing brains. On top of it, we're distorting the growth process. By the way, this phenomena is so significant that you can actually see it under an electron microscope, the distorted shape of the nerves. Or you can grind up an animal's brain and find cell loss in particular areas. This is serious. They don't care. You see, this is the same people who do lobotomy. You think they didn't know they were killing brain cells? This is the same people who still do electroshock. You don't think they don't know in their hearts they're causing damage? They know on some level that giving people convulsions with electricity is not good for their brains. They have to. They see what happens. Now, when you overstimulate the brain, the hypothalamus of the brain, you then send abnormal signals to the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland puts out prolactin, growth hormone, the steroid control stuff. And we know that kids don't grow well on Ritalin. Now, you know how my colleagues think of that? They think, oh, a little shorter and a little skinnier. Probably going to recover. When? Nowadays, we don't even take kids off the drugs. They don't think there's a brain in that body. That's not growing at the same rate either. And God knows what's happening to it when there's a disruption of this growth hormone cycle. Now, we've measured this. We've measured this again and again. It is known. It is so one-to-one that if your child's got a normal growth hormone cycle during sleep, he skipped his Ritalin. I could go on and on like this. We have studies that show when you give a few doses of Ritalin, blood flow to the brain is cut off 20-25%. Routinely. We know this. Does your pediatrician know it? Not a chance. If he read it, he wouldn't know it. It wouldn't register. Moving on to how the drug works. Anything that damages brain function tends to make people more docile. Do you know that for all the kids that we're giving Ritalin so they'll sit still in school, there's probably 2 other kids smoking dope to try to do the same thing, to make it through the day, or drinking to make it through the day? Almost any toxic agent lets people get through the day. But Ritalin and stimulants are particularly interesting. And here we have this whole bunch of animal research, which again, so help me God, the guy at NIMH who's in charge of child pathology had never heard of. and is in charge of this conference is never heard of. And the studies on animals show universally what the drugs do to all children and animals. It has nothing to do with whether you have a disorder. That would be like saying when you saw a drunk on the street, why, he must be susceptible to alcohol. It's nonsense. Drugs affect everybody the same way, basically, accounting for normal human variation, which is, of course, fairly wide, but they basically affect you the same way, whether you are hyperactive, underactive, mean, nice, nasty, whatever. Drugs affect your brain, the machine, in a certain way. It doesn't matter whether you have ADHD or not. And, of course, and this they do know, the experts. They're not going to tell you this, but this they know. This is in all the textbooks. So we can see what happens to a rat, and we can know what effect these drugs have on behavior. First, let's think about what a rat's like. Some people own pet rats. Ever owned a pet rat? They're really sweet. They're very active. They're very inquisitive. They're very friendly. They socialize. They explore. In fact, all creatures, all of God's creatures of any complexity are full of trouble. They're always looking, smelling, trying to get out, not wanting to be caged in. And if they are youngins, they're all driving their parents crazy. And we all watch the Discovery Channel enough to know that mama bears just have to whack their little ones and push them aside once in a while. They never hurt them, but they got to do, I don't mean whack them, but they all got to try to control the rambunctiousness of play. This is about all young. And we used to think it was about children. There's no society, pre-industrial society, there's no so-called primitive society that ever assumed that its children should get up in the morning, move to the center of camp and sit there all day long while one boring tribesperson taught them about the woods, the birds, and the trees. They let the kids loose and had them taught by a lot of people. This is unheard of to expect this of children. So what happens? Now that I've told you what rats are like, that they're like puppies. What happens if you give a puppy Ritalin? It has two effects. First, it stops all spontaneous behavior. It knocks out exploration, novelty seeking, no matter how you define it. And the animal people have all kinds of ways of defining it. It knocks out spontaneous behavior. But then it does something very curious, perhaps by its effect on the dopamine nerves, and there's a huge nerve center in the brain that to some extent has an effect on compulsive activity. By overstimulating that center, it makes the animals compulsive. And the language is interesting. They call it stereotypical behavior. Instead of exploring, they just look at their paws or chew the bars. They don't even pace around the cage anymore. Instead, they stay in one corner and move back and forth. The behavior becomes what they literally will call in the animal literature meaningless, robotic, over-focused, obsessive-compulsive. It makes a good caged animal. We are making good caged children. Absolutely no question about it, at the risk of their brains. And I've only begun to touch on the adverse effects of these drugs. They often make kids worse because they have such a negative impact on the brain that after the first dose, research has shown, by the evening, the child's brain's rebelling. After the very first dose. And the original research was done on normals. Don't let anybody kid you that there's a difference between how this drug affects normals and other kids. If they tell you that, they're either lying or really ignorant. Nobody thinks that anymore. It's a PR thing. Oh, it just affects ADHD kids. It's a PR thing. So that by the evening, the odds are your child may be worse because the brain's rebounding. So what's the doctor going to do? Well, after a few months, you'll have him on Klonopin or some sedative at night. Or maybe another dose of Ritalin. Then the kid won't sleep. Interestingly enough, there aren't 5 studies in the 10,000 in the literature that ask children how they feel. What does that tell you? The studies that do indicate first that the children lie to the doctors. Of course they do. They tell them what the doctors want to hear. And second, that even though they're lying to the doctors, you can still tell that they basically are made uncomfortable by it. This is not a nice experience, unless you want to become a speed freak. up your dose and keep yourself going. By the way, all this was known not just from animal studies, but from studies of Ritalin addiction, which now those studies are 30 years old. What happens to people who become addicted to Ritalin, amphetamine, and methamphetamine is they begin to do compulsive, stupid behavior endlessly. For example, they wash a car all day. One of the studies I'll be citing at my NIH conference found that more than half the kids became compulsive when you really look at what's happening to them in an ordinary clinical trial. And the kids would do things like finally rake the leaves. Hey! Well, the kid's out there raking the leaves for 5 hours. Then he's sitting on the ground catching the leaves. It develops self-defeating, meaningless behavior. Now, it's a continuum. If it's just a little self-defeating, a little docile, a little robotic, that's called good school behavior. When it gets extreme, they call it an adverse drug reaction. But it's all adverse drug reaction. It's the whole thing from start to finish. The drug is not improving the brain. It's one giant adverse drug reaction. But because it makes children docile, compliant, flattened spontaneous behavior, and makes them willing to do rote, compulsive behaviors, we consider it an improvement.